It was Halloween night, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet. The usual decorations were up. Jack-o'-lanterns flickered on porches, skeletons hung from trees, and ghosts swayed in the cool October wind. But this year felt different. There was something heavier in the air, something that made the skin prickle and the heart race a little faster. Jake and his girlfriend Emma were out for a late-night walk, enjoying the deserted streets. They'd always loved Halloween, the thrill of spooks and scares that made the holiday electric. But as they strolled through the neighborhood, they started to notice an odd pattern. Every few houses, the lights were off, the windows dark, as if the families had vanished. The typical sounds of laughter and shouts from kids and parents seemed to be swallowed up by silence. "Maybe everyone's at a Halloween party?" Emma suggested, though her voice wavered. Jake glanced around, uneasy. "Maybe. But it's weird, right? It's like no one's here." They passed another house. This one had a scarecrow propped in the yard, a typical Halloween decoration, except this scarecrow's head was oddly real. The face was detailed, too detailed, with glassy eyes and skin that looked waxy. The mouth was sewn shut with black thread, and in the dim light, Jake could have sworn it looked right at him. "Is it just me?" Jake whispered. "Or does that look like an actual face?" Emma shuddered, clutching his arm. "Let's keep going. It's just someone trying to freak people out. Come on." They hurried along, but the scarecrow haunted their minds as they moved further down the street. The silence grew even thicker, and shadows stretched longer and darker as they walked. Finally, they reached Emma's house, which stood alone at the end of the road, half hidden by overgrown trees. Her house was dark, too. "I don't remember turning off all the lights," she murmured, her fingers trembling against the keys as she fumbled with the lock. Jake felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Maybe your parents turned them off?" "No," she whispered, eyes wide. "They went to visit my aunt in another state for the week. I'm supposed to be home alone." The door creaked open, and they stepped inside, feeling around for the light switch. But when Emma flipped it, nothing happened. The power was out. They moved cautiously, Jake pulling out his phone and using the flashlight to guide their way through the living room and into the kitchen. As they rounded the corner, the beam of light fell onto the table. Jake's heart stopped. There, in the center of the table, was a carefully folded note. "Welcome home." It was written in crimson red ink, but as Jake leaned closer, he realized it wasn't ink at all. The color was dark, sticky, blood. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Emma gasped and stumbled back, her hands flying to her mouth as she backed into the counter. Just then, the sound of slow, dragging footsteps echoed from upstairs, growing louder with each second. "We have to leave," Jake hissed, grabbing Emma's hand. But before they could turn toward the door, a tall figure appeared in the hallway, blocking their exit. The figure wore a mask, one that was eerily familiar. The same sewn-up mouth, glassy eyes, and waxy skin as the scarecrow they'd passed earlier. Emma's scream echoed through the house as the figure lurched forward, trapping them between the kitchen and the back door. Jake grabbed a knife from the countertop and held it up defensively, his hands shaking. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying them. Then, in a voice that was a mockery of humanity, it whispered, "Trick or treat." Jake lunged forward, but the figure moved with inhuman speed, like sidestepping and grabbing Emma. She thrashed and screamed as the figure held her tight, one hand covering her mouth as it whispered into her ear. Desperate, Jake swung his knife, but his hand passed right through the figure, who dissolved into thin air, leaving only a chilling echo of laughter. Emma staggered back, wide-eyed and terrified. "Jake," she gasped, "look at your hands." He looked down, his stomach twisting. His hands were covered in blood, but he hadn't touched anyone. He looked around the kitchen, and there in the corner, he noticed something that made his heart drop. Another scarecrow, slumped against the wall. But this time he recognized the face. It was Emma. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. Emma had never made it out of the house. The figure he'd walked with, talked to, held hands with, it hadn't been her at all. It was just a trick, a twisted illusion. And as he stared into her glassy, sewn-shut eyes, he felt a hand grip his shoulder from behind, cold and unyielding. A voice whispered in his ear, "Happy Halloween." Then everything went black. On a stormy night in the dead of October, a couple, Mia and Alex, found themselves lost on a winding road through a dense forest. The trees, twisted and gnarled, reached out like skeletal hands in the flash of lightning, and the wind howled through the branches like a warning. They were on their way back from a late Halloween party, the laughter and noise still echoing in their minds, but as the road stretched on, the darkness around them seemed to close in, oppressive and thick. Finally, Alex spotted a faint light flickering through the trees, a worn-looking inn tucked just off the road. It seemed like the only refuge, so they pulled up, eager to escape the growing storm. The inn was old, with peeling paint and broken shingles, a strange place to still be open at this hour. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something else, something that made their noses wrinkle, like iron. They rang a small, tarnished bell at the front desk, and after a moment, a tall, gaunt man appeared. He wore a grin that didn't reach his eyes, and his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Welcome to the Woodhaven Inn," he said, his gaze lingering on each of them. "We rarely get guests this late." Too tired and cold to care, they agreed to stay, and the man led them up a narrow staircase. The carpet was frayed and old, and the portraits on the walls seemed to watch them as they passed. He opened the door to their room, and they saw a quaint but old-fashioned space with a large bed covered in a faded, once beautiful quilt. "If you need anything," the man said softly, "just call for me. But don't leave the room after midnight." With that cryptic warning, he left, his footsteps fading down the hall. The two laughed it off, unpacked, and prepared to settle in for the night. But the unsettling feeling from the lobby stayed with them, and as the storm raged outside, sleep wouldn't come. The wind rattled the windows, and every creak and groan of the building seemed to carry a message. At precisely midnight, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of whispering voices, muffled but distinct, coming from just outside their door. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they could almost make out words. Then a loud knock echoed through the room. Mia sat up, her heart pounding. "Who would be knocking at this hour?" she whispered, clutching Alex's arm. Alex got out of bed and approached the door cautiously, pressing his ear against it. All he could hear was the ragged breathing of someone on the other side. He turned back to Mia, shaken. "I don't think we should open it." But the knocking continued, insistent, and the whispers became pleading, desperate. They began to sound like voices they knew, voices of friends, family members, people who shouldn't even know where they were. Then, one voice whispered in a tone that froze them both. "Let me in, Alex," it said softly, a perfect imitation of Mia's voice. "I'm cold. Let me in." Alex stumbled back, looking at Mia in horror. She was sitting on the bed, pale and trembling. They stayed there, motionless, the knocking turning into frantic pounding, the whispers into guttural pleas. And just when it seemed the door would burst open, silence fell. The inn was deathly quiet, the only sound the wind outside. Shaken and unable to sleep, they stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to leave. When they finally did venture out of the room, they found the hall empty, silent. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, and the lobby was filled with dust as if untouched for years. Desperate for answers, they left the inn and drove to the nearest town, where they learned the horrifying truth. The Woodhaven Inn had burned down decades ago in a fire that had claimed the lives of every guest and staff member inside. The locals spoke of how the inn came back every October, luring in lost travelers, only for them to disappear without a trace. And when Mia and Alex returned to where the inn had been the night before, all they found was a foundation covered in weeds, with the remains of a tarnished bell lying among the rubble. On a bleak October night, as thick fog rolled over the countryside, a teenage girl named Lily was babysitting for the Simmons family in a small, isolated town. The Simmonses were a quiet family, with 2 young children and a large, crumbling Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The house was old and cold, filled with shadows and eerie creaks. Every door hinge groaned, and the wallpaper seemed to peel on its own, revealing strange marks underneath, claw-like scratches and faint red stains. After putting the kids to bed, Lily settled on the couch, flicking through channels on the old TV, the static from it filling the silence of the house. As the fog thickened outside, she thought she heard faint footsteps upstairs. She brushed it off, convincing herself it was just the old house settling, until the footsteps turned into soft whispers. "Lily," a voice seemed to whisper, though it was almost too faint to be sure. She froze, heart pounding, but then thought it must have been her imagination. She decided to check on the kids, creeping upstairs to the bedroom. Both children were sound asleep, blankets pulled up to their chins, faces peaceful. Relieved, she started back down the hall, but then something caught her eye. Down the hall, near the old nursery room, a shadow moved. Lily stopped, staring down the hallway, heart hammering in her chest. She stepped closer, slowly, peering into the dim nursery. She saw a rocking chair, slightly moving back and forth, creaking in the silence. The chill in the room was bone deep, and she felt an unnatural heaviness settle around her. As she was about to turn away, the soft whisper came again, but this time louder. "Lily, come play." She stepped back, fear spiking through her as she saw something pale and small crouching under the chair. The figure was a child, a boy, about 6 or 7, with dark circles under his eyes and skin so pale it was almost translucent. He looked at her with wide, unblinking eyes, and then he smiled. "Come play, Lily," he said again, his voice a low, chilling whisper. Panic took over, and she bolted down the stairs, grabbing her phone to call the Simmonses. The line rang and rang, but no one picked up. She tried calling her own parents, but there was only static on the line. She felt a prickling sensation, like she was being watched. Suddenly, she heard soft footsteps coming down the stairs. She turned, expecting to see the children, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, though, closer, as if someone was standing right behind her. "Lily," a familiar voice whispered, this time her own voice. She spun around, horrified, but the room was empty. Terrified, she ran back to the children's room. She burst in, only to find the 2 beds empty, the sheets crumpled as if someone had yanked them out of bed. She screamed, calling their names, but there was no answer. She ran through the house, opening every door, searching every room, but the house was empty. The children were gone. Just then, she heard a faint scratching sound from the front door. She opened it slowly, peering out into the foggy night. There on the porch were 2 small, muddy footprints leading away from the house, disappearing into the fog. The footprints weren't from the children's shoes. They were bare, small, and unmistakably human. And as she stared at the footprints, another whisper came from behind her. It was the voice of the boy in the nursery. "Lily," it said, close enough to feel the icy breath against her neck. "We're not done playing." When the Simmonses returned home later that night, they found the house silent and empty. Lily, the children, everyone was gone. All they found was the old rocking chair, still slowly creaking back and forth in the nursery, and 2 small, muddy footprints leading away into the night.